Hey, welcome to the Bookshook, the open air meeting place where Jewish stories, voices, and creative journeys come to life. I'm Yehudit Singer Freud, and each week I sit down with Jewish authors to explore the books that they've written. Today we have with us Mitchell Silk, the author of A Seat at the Table, and we're going to be talking about him and his inspiration behind the book. So welcome, Mitch. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Yehudit. It's great to be here.
So let's just jump right into your background story and what kind of was a springboard for your career. I am curious. You have spent your career specializing in China. It's languages, history, trade policies, financial infrastructure. When did your affinity for China begin, and what drew you to this field originally?
Well, I'd love to say that, my drive and aspiration and ultimately success in representing really big investors and financial institutions in China and ultimately representing our government in the biggest trade negotiations that we ever had with China was really calculated and very well planned out. But the reality is that it very much was not. It all really started in the back of a Chinese restaurant when I was a teenager. And funny enough, being a dishwasher and later a prep cook and a busboy and then finally a waiter in a Chinese restaurant really interestingly, by way of what I call hashgacha, divine providence, defined my career. I went out just after bar mitzvah because of our family circumstances and the need to help my mother with home finances to work. The salary that I made was helping her and helped me buy things that I need, ultimately helped me save up for a car and pay for my tuition in college. And I went from one job to another in the restaurant. I learned pretty early on that if I wanted to succeed, ultimately when becoming a waiter, if I wanted to succeed and maximize my earning potential through tips, that I had to do a number of things well. I had to interact with people well. I had to make sure that they were happy. And one element of making sure that they were happy was ensuring that their food came out of the kitchen hot and on a timely basis. And in those days, very much unlike today, the cooks were pretty much fresh in the States, spoke no English, and so I took it upon myself to learn the lingo, as it were. I thought I was learning Chinese. What I was actually learning was a dialect of Chinese spoken in southeastern China called Cantonese, spoken mainly in the Guangdong province. At the time in the US, 95+% of the Chinese, because of earlier immigration trends, came from Guangdong province and so therefore spoke Cantonese. Very few of the Chinese in America spoke Mandarin. It was a rude awakening about 5 or 6 years in that I actually learned that there was more than one dialect of Chinese, Mandarin being the national dialect and the most widely spoken. And so when I was about 17 or 18, I embarked on an intensive drive to learn Mandarin. I attended Middlebury's Summer School of Chinese in Vermont, which was a great experience. I packed in a year's worth of college studies in 9 weeks, and then the director of that program suggested that I go on and study at a university in Taiwan, which I did for a year. And at the end of that year, I was fluent in both Cantonese and Mandarin. And as further extension of the hashgacha, it was one contact after another that led me to go to Georgetown School of Foreign Service undergrad. My professor there introduced me to one of the leading professors in Chinese law, who I ended up studying under. He in turn introduced me to somebody else and somebody else. I ultimately ended up working at one of the big Wall Street firms and was recruited midway through my early years to work for a firm that was opening up in Hong Kong to capitalize on the Chinese opening of their power and infrastructure markets to foreign investment. And that was what defined my career. Functionally, I became an expert in energy and infrastructure finance. I had a lot of China expertise. And around the time that I was considering my next move out of big law, which I had been practicing for 30 years, President Trump won the election in 2017. One of my closest partners was appointed to a senior position at the Treasury Department. He knew that China and infrastructure were key priorities for the president at the beginning of Trump 45, and that was the beginning of that story. It was just really, in a word, Yehudit, act of hashgacha after act of hashgacha after act of hashgacha. And that's really the only way that I
Yeah,
can
that's
explain
pretty
it.
amazing and unique in so many ways. So you mentioned that you spent a lot of time, studying Mandarin, studying Cantonese. You then came back to the States, went to Georgetown. You studied law at the University of Maryland, where there's a very sizable Jewish community. And then you moved to Beijing at a time when China was just starting to open itself up to the rest of the world. So this was in the mid 80s, correct? So
Yes,
so how
that's
did you
right.
handle that transition? I mean, you were an observant Jew, visibly Jewish. So what was that like for you? And what was it like? What were the reactions of the Chinese seeing an Orthodox Jew at that time?
So I would, it's a great question you did, and you've brought out a very interesting juxtaposition, which I wanna unwrap a little bit. But I would kind of divide it into the logistical side of things and the kind of spiritual side, the unknowns and the things that you can't really put your finger on. Logistics wise, it was tough. It was a midbar. It was a desert. Beijing at the time, there was no semblance of Orthodox Jewish life as there is today and as there has been for the past 20 years or so. Food was a challenge. Obviously, there were no services. I davened b'yechidus, and I would make every effort to go down to Hong Kong where there were regular services, definitely for all of the Yom Tovim. And I would try to make it down once a month for Shabbos. I would bring food back with me, canned goods and dry goods. It was a challenge, nothing that one can't overcome with a simple diet, but it was a challenge. But I juxtaposed that against what I had in Baltimore. So for 3 years, I was spoiled by the lovely community in Baltimore. I lived on Taney right off of Park Heights. I was a 4-minute walk to Rebbe Heinemann Shul and a 5 to 7 to 10-minute walk to almost every other shul in the area. I had my choice of where I would go. I had my favorite spots where I would go during the weekend, during Shabbos. And the most lovely families who were always eager to invite over a young, single law student for Shabbos and Yontif meals. And I went from all of that to really nothing. The interesting side that I found of it, Yehudit, was that the lack of that community, the lack of the people, the lack of the infrastructure, I found kind of created a wall, which for me brought me to be a little bit more insular and focus more on myself. What was up around me, which was very, very, very different from Baltimore, I found to be very much a reminder of where I came from and how the environment in which I found myself was utterly different than what I had in Baltimore or where I grew up in Chicago. And so in a way, I felt that spiritually it was actually a very strong year for me. I mean, every day I had a little room at Beijing University. I would put on my tefillin and I felt strong. I would daven b'yechidus. I felt strong just because the circumstances and the environment around me were just so utterly different. And it's perhaps we could call it happenstance or perhaps we could call it hashgacha. But right before I left for Beijing on that 1-year trip, and I did come home for about a month or so in the middle, Herman Wouk came out with one of my most favorite books of his, and a book that did very well for him, Inside Outside, which tells the story about a lawyer, interestingly, who went through phases of religiosity. And I could very much relate to the story in the book, and I felt that interestingly, Herman Wouk, a man who I had actually sat next to in shul when I was at Georgetown University undergrad for 2 years, was with me on my little journey during that year in Beijing.
And how did the Chinese people around you relate to you?
Um, so let's put things in context, Judith. It was, let's call it 1986, 1987. China had just opened in the very late 70s, 79, 80, 81, under the policies of then Premier Deng Xiaoping. And so the Chinese at that time were really very much getting their first taste and their first exposure to foreigners. So it was very, very early days. In the bigger cities where I tended to spend most of my time, Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou or Shenzhen, the traffic of foreigners, the volume of foreigners was greater. So people had a little bit more of a reference point. When I would go out into the countryside or still very heavily populated, but less populated than cities like Beijing or Shanghai. When I would go to those inner cities, I'm guessing that I was probably the first foreigner that people saw.
Wow.
So on the one hand, those that had a little bit of exposure to foreigners, I don't think really had a basis to distinguish so much between noticeable Caucasian ethnicity and certainly religiosity. I really don't think that point in China, I don't think people were at that stage, right? And so I was a foreigner. I was a Waigorren. I was an alien. I was somebody that didn't come from China. And certainly when I would go inland, all the more so. And so, I remember probably the best example of this is when I visited the once capital of China in Henan province. It's a city called Kaifeng, which was basically the center of trading in China for many centuries. It was the easternmost point of the Silk Road, where traders from Europe and from Persia, Middle East would traverse the Silk Road, bring goods from the West, trade for Chinese goods, and then bring them back. And as a result of there being a lot of Jewish traders coming from then Persia into Kaifeng and being very active in that whole element of commerce, the Persian Jews actually set up a community with a shul, with a cemetery, with all the Jewish infrastructure that one would require, that was in existence for hundreds of years. It slowly died out because of simply assimilation. And there are books that have been written about this. It's kind of very interesting socio-cultural issue. But I remember arriving there. I had two very interesting stories. I'm only going to tell you one of them for limits of time. But I was really keen to find the neighborhood where the Jews had lived. We knew that the synagogue building still stood. It housed a factory. We also knew that there was a cemetery that existed where you could find matzevahs with Hebrew writing on them. So after a lot of twists and turns and a lot of time, we finally made our way to the street where the synagogue stood. I asked around. There was still very, very heavy control of the Communist Party at the neighborhood and the street level. So people were very reluctant to speak with foreigners, but I did get out of somebody that the woman who was the granddaughter of the last ever halachic Jew in China, who had passed away some decades prior, that his granddaughter was standing at the corner. And her surname was Zhang. So I walked up to her in my best Mandarin and I spoke to her, Madam Zhang, so on and so forth. And I couldn't get a peep out of her. She did not even want to dignify my existence. I'm sure it's because she knew she was being watched by the neighborhood CCP committee. We went back and forth, literally no response, a grunt here or there. But ultimately, I wasn't able to engage with her. I left rather disappointed. We finished up our trip. We had a great and exciting time in Kaifeng. Went back to Hong Kong, and interestingly, that was the week immediately prior to Rosh Hashanah that year. And it dawned on me when I walked into shul for Rosh Hashanah that I finally figured out why Madam Zhang didn't want to engage with me. I think, Yehudit, It's because I didn't bring her a bottle of Manischewitz for Rosh Hashanah.
Obviously. Um, in all seriousness, though, did you ever find out what the reason could have possibly been that she didn't speak with you?
I'm quite convinced that given the time, there were very heavy restrictions on engagement with foreigners. You had to have approval from your local Communist Party
Wow.
authority, and I think she just didn't want to be brought in for
Oh,
questioning.
fascinating.
The level of control was very, very invasive. It still continues to be in many
Hmm.
respects, and in many ways with computers, it's much easier. But in those days, it was rather pervasive and invasive, and I think she just didn't want
Yeah.
the hassle,
Wow,
quite
that
frankly.
is wild. That's wild. So that actually is a very good segue to one of the questions that I've been wanting to ask you for a long time. And we're going to go directly into one of the topics that you talk about in depth in your book, which is that you talk about how basically China has made it their mission to implement laws and practices to harm the U.S. and regular citizens. There's a tremendous amount of control on their own citizens. And you talk about how China seeks to steal data, intellectual property, internal communications, and yet nowadays, on a day to day level, so many of us, regular consumers, are using China owned sites like Temu, AliExpress. The younger generation is obsessed with TikTok. And so, you're talking about the communist regime in China. And so I'm wondering if you could explain to us in kind of plebeian terms what is the danger here? And is the Chinese government really using our data? And if so, for what?
So I think the simple answers you did, great question, are simply yes, it is a problem. And what are they using the data for? Really hard to say, but for sure, the primary purpose is data collection. There are a lot of agencies throughout the world. I mean, having worked in government, I know this, that collect data for the sake of collecting data. A lot of the time, it sits somewhere and is only used when needed. So the second one is a little bit harder to answer with specifics, but the first one is yes, for sure. And if somebody's collecting my data, that concerns me. I can't speak for everybody on the show, can't speak for you, but it concerns me. And it was an issue that I had to look after in parts of my work when I was at Treasury. But just to back up for a moment, to kind of provide a little bit of backdrop and gloss for the question and the answer, since the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, under their constitution, the country operates on a control economic basis. All transactions, uh, everything begins at the top and is under the control of the state apparatus, the highest point of which is the State Council. And so, for example, what I saw in my practice of law, I lived in Greater China for 15 years, is that, and I spent probably 80 to 90% of my work helping foreign investors and financiers in mainland China do very large transactions, is that every transaction is controlled by the state. The approval process that they impose for every trade transaction, most trade transactions, certainly every direct investment transaction, and most financings, at least financings that involve foreign currency, have to go through one control process or another. And those control processes are governed by laws that we can learn about, and then they're also governed by policies that are put into place by the Communist Party that impose certain economic and policy testing to judge and determine whether the proposed transaction is in line with prevailing policy. And so while many projects that I worked on passed the economic test, they didn't pass the policy test and were either delayed in approval or they were nixed. China has began a very intensive wave of outbound investment in the early 2000s that picked up around 2005-6 through 2010 and further on. And they've imposed a similar approach in how they engage, at least for the state-owned companies, in their investment activity abroad and their trade activity abroad, which again is highly controlled at the central level. And on the outbound basis, for trade and development financing is highly subsidized by the government, which gives Chinese enterprises that benefit from those subsidies a leg up against those against whom they're competing. So for example, a lot of the trade issues that we had, particularly our trade deficit, the issues that we had were based on those subsidies and challenges that we had with them because the Chinese exporters and manufacturers were getting a leg up on our folks. So that's basically the backdrop. I mean, coming back to the TikTok issue, this has been a big issue for the US government since I was in during Trump 45, and you'll probably recall that there was an action taken at the very end of Trump 45. Secretary Mnuchin, for whom I worked, took an action that was partially implemented and then stalled and put off by President Biden during the whole of his administration. And the issue really didn't come back until President Trump came back in 47. And now it appears, based on the trip that Secretary Bessent took to Madrid about a week ago, that there is a framework for how the US and China have agreed for TikTok and its ultimate parent to go forward in terms of ownership, operation, and control of things like the algorithm that drives TikTok. And that arrangement is meant to provide better protection for the American people and for the rest of the world. I mean, what are the issues with TikTok and what challenges are there? I mean, I could go on for an hour. I know that we only have 30 minutes, but there are some really significant social issues. There are really some very significant political issues where TikTok is used as a mechanism to spread misinformation, and a lot of misinformation relating to Israel, particularly post-October 7th. And so there are plenty of very, very fundamental challenges that we in America have with TikTok and would like to see those righted. It's a tremendous vehicle for communication, and it should only be used in the right way.
And so do you see that there is potential for the United States to take more control over the algorithms and, TikTok in general?
Well, that is the whole focus of the action. I mean, that with control of the algorithm and ownership of the ultimate corporate entity were two of the key elements of the framework that Secretary Mnuchin put forward and that we were implementing and that I understand are on the table and have been agreed in principle under Secretary Bessent. That's my understanding. But without those Yehudit, I don't think any arrangement.
Well, I look forward to, hearing your perspective on this as it develops. I mean, clearly, this is an ongoing issue, and so many of us, there are millions of people around the States and all over the world that are curious and also suspicious. So I look forward to, hearing more about that. I want to kind of move into a different topic that relates to your book. In A Seat at the Table, you talk about the importance of having a personal touch, even in some high-level negotiations and meetings with top leaders. And I was wondering if you could share a time when your personal touch helped resolve a high-stake negotiation.
Yeah, great question, Yehudit. Let me start by a little bit of a teeny bit of background on the reason why we chose the title of the book, A Seat at the Table, which very much goes in one dimension to this issue of a personal touch. So what we really wanted to convey in the title was a seat at the table at three different dimensions. Dimension number one being at the national level, where so much of the book shows how the President Trump, has ensured that the United States has a seat at the table, a seat of leadership and a seat that is guided by values-driven and principled policy that is putting the interests of the American people first, his America First policies. So that's one level of it. The other level of it, second level, is that I feel, and I very much encourage everybody that gets their hands on the book or hears about it, to try to create their own seat at the table, because everybody can make a difference in policy, whether it's at the grassroots level, at the neighborhood level, or at local, state, federal level. There's always room for more good people in process, and we need more people, good people in government. But the third level, which is really the one that you were talking about, is the personal touch of how I was able to use what I refer to as dinner table diplomacy to do my job better, to realize more impact. And I had a pretty big portfolio, Yehudit. I looked after all of the functional offices in international affairs within Treasury. So that included trade, it included infrastructure finance, which covers the U.S. Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation. I looked after the financial, regulatory, and fintech issues internationally as they apply to our guys, and domestically as they apply to foreign financial institutions in the United States, and the Office of Technical Assistance, which is basically the U.S. government's financial advisor to other foreign governments. And I had hundreds of people working under me. And my day consisted of engaging with a lot of counterparts. Most of the time they were ministerial level folks. They were ministers or vice ministers or ambassadors of countries. And I found that I had two choices to get my job done. Choice number one was I'd be wheeled off, with the mission and my group of people. I'd be directed to a table. I'd be given my talkers. We would, of course, have gone through, reviewed, composed, edited, and so on, and sat at a table and delivered my talkers to advocate for the interest of the United States and its people in any one of a number of areas, whether it was trade, whether it was fintech, whether it was financial regulation, insurance companies, whatsoever. And that was all very formal. You could call it political theater. And sometimes you score some points on the board, sometimes you didn't. But what I found was that in order to get people to really come around, it was the personal exchanges that we had with them. So the goal would be go to a meeting of the G20, and you sit down at the table for your designated 1 hour or 2 hour meeting, but then have as many sidebars with as many people so that you could advocate with them one-on-one off of the table. What I found to be most effective in that work was actually to have people over for dinner. And I knew that there was a very limited number of choices of kosher establishments in Washington before I went down. My wife and I decided that we were going to buy a house in the diplomatic district in Kalorama. It was 2 minutes away from the local school. And I was a mile walk away from Treasury, very centrally located. And my approach was, if I had an issue, I would invite the ambassador from wherever to come over for dinner, or I would invite them to come over for lunch. Created a little bit of a quandary when they wanted to reciprocate, right? Because I was not so prepared to go to somebody else's embassy and be served non-kosher food, but one learns to navigate around that. But I can give you one great example. I formulated and implemented a pretty big global initiative to further U.S. growth interests through infrastructure finance. And we engaged formally with about 40 countries throughout the world. The way that we engaged was we would go to them and we would say, we understand what your plans are for growing energy and infrastructure to fuel your development. We've got some ideas that we'd like to share from you on how you could do so with more impact and less pain points. And so what I would do is I would formulate an investment program that was comprised of very specific and concrete projects. We would explain to them the contours of the project, how they could go about developing and structuring them, and most importantly, using U.S. government finance mechanisms and private capital mechanisms. We would explain how they could finance those projects without using government funding, which is a very big deal. It allows the financial markets to work as they work best, and it doesn't put undue fiscal pressure on countries to build out the energy and infrastructure that they need so great to realize goals. And every country that I would walk into with these ideas, I would present them. The first meeting almost invariably would go that they'd give me the floor, I'd start talking, and people would look at me like I had two horns growing out of my head. And it wasn't until after some conditioning after the first meeting and the time that we got to the second meeting that light bulbs would start to go off. And by the third meeting, people were all in. And in order to get to the productive second meeting, I would typically invite folks over for dinner. I did so with the Vietnamese. We had a very, very large and ambitious program with them, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment projects. It took some time. I became very friendly with the then ambassador. He's now deputy foreign minister. He wanted to reciprocate and have me over to the embassy, so that took about 3 weeks for my front office to arrange kosher food and how to deal with matters. But we did go to his embassy and allow him to reciprocate. A story in and of itself, which is in the book. But the best result of that engagement was that the ambassador actually ensured that when we went to Vietnam for our first presentation of that very ambitious programming, that we got a seat at the table with the most senior economic decision maker in the whole country, who invited me to a state dinner after this was not on the first visit, after he had visited me with a delegation of 30 at my house in Borough Park, where we served him all of the greatest Jewish delicacies that you can imagine, with some wonderful Israeli wine.
Wow, that's fantastic. That really goes to show that extending your hand and offering, an authentic personal touch really has an impact. That's fantastic.
And it wasn't just serving the meal. They all knew that I planned the menu around them. I shopped. They knew that I prepped. They knew that I cooked. They would see me serving and cleaning up, and people could feel the personal touch, and therefore that's my illustration of how a seat at the table really
Yeah,
brings
that's wonderful.
benefit.
I noticed that you took that metaphor and applied it in a number of different ways throughout the book, and showing the importance of acknowledging each person who you met with and who you have the negotiations with, and really giving each person an honor of having a seat at the table. So I think it's the perfect title for the book. I would like to now shift over to talking about your Jewish identity, and you are the first Hasidic person to serve in a Senate-confirmed position in the federal government. And you have been visibly Jewish for a very, very long time, traveling all over the world, being a visible Jew. And right now, Jewish people throughout the world are having a very hard time because anti-Semitism is rising. And especially on college campuses, it's a very scary time for Jewish kids to show their Jewish identity on campus. And I'm curious, what advice do you have for young Jewish professionals who are scared to appear as visibly Jewish?
My simple input is to stand tall, Yehudit, and to be smart and to take the higher ground. Not engaged when one doesn't need to engage, and if one really needs to engage, then engage. But I look back on my career. I started on Wall Street at a time when there were very, very few from folks at the associate level, certainly. I was certainly an oddity. People kind of didn't know quite what to make of it, certainly around Shabbos observance and Yom Tov observance. Hong Kong was not that much of a challenge. I mean, I went to Hong Kong for just under 15 years when I was a mid-level associate. The firms that I was at, particularly Allen & Overy, where I was for 20 years, was highly, highly supportive of my Shabbos and Yom Tov observance, and I found that if I was able to build up a great team around me, that we could all cover for each other. And so there were very, very few instances that I can think of where I was even remotely concerned about what would be on Shabbos. There were the one or two instances where issues arose, specifically one that came up when I was implementing the CARES Act, trying to save 700,000 aviation jobs during the pandemic, where I did actually have to walk from my house into the building. Thankfully, everything was under control, but I didn't really have that many kind of challenges to Shabbos or Yom Tov as to how people like related to me and looked at me. So I think different answer for different times. As I said a little bit earlier, like I was just another foreigner in China. So the fact that I wore a black hat and a black suit and a white shirt, and somebody from somewhere else wore a different national garb, I think that the vast majority of people in China in those days, not necessarily today, but in those days would just look at me as yet another foreigner. The manifestation of that garb in the White House, in Main Treasury when I was in government, I think a rather different angle or different gloss from my standpoint. And my simple point there was that, throughout my legal career and the time that I was in government, and now, of course, I have a uniform that I wear. I'm only wearing part of it now, which is my white shirt. But when I go out, I have a tie, I have a black suit and jacket, and I have a black hat. And so, like, that's my uniform, and that's how I dress wherever I go. Every day I had to walk through 3 levels of the Secret Service to get into the building. If I had to go across the street to the White House for meetings, which was at least once a week, but quite frequently almost every day of the week, I'd have to go through another couple of levels of Secret Service. I'd walk the halls with admins, bump into the vice president, secretaries, and so on and so forth. Cabinet members, sit in the situation room, and the one overriding feeling that I had always, Yehudit, was that of immense pressure, because I knew that people looked at me and maybe they did not recognize, oh, this guy is this kind of Orthodox or that kind of Orthodox, but they knew that I was an observant Jew, unless they mistook me for, some other religion. Most would recognize me as a unless they mistook me as an Amish, they would recognize me as a
it's a lot of responsibility.
Jew. And that, it brought an immense amount of pressure on me. I constantly felt that every blink of the eye, every facial expression, every word that came out of my mouth could be the difference between a Kiddush Hashem and a Chilul Hashem. And so, that pushed me along. I was able to utilize pretty frequently a little bit of good Jewish humor to keep things going, but it was a ton of pressure. And that is a message that I think everybody should take back. The challenges that we have, and I'm referring really to college and university students, the challenges that we have on campus and in the workplace for our young folks today is crazy. It's not driven just by the traditional forms of anti-Semitism, but it's being funded by a lot of agitation, a lot of organizations that are engaged in agitation for the sake of agitation that are very, very well funded by folks mainly in the Middle East. And it's brought a whole additional element to the challenges that we're facing. So we have to be smart when we engage, but we must stand tall and we must be principled. And there, if you look at all the social media, there's some people that are really great on social media and pushing back. The arguments of response about what's happening in the Middle East today, what happened on October 7th, what happened post-October 7th, the retorts and the responses are rather simple, and we need to keep it at that. The truth will always rise up to the top, and there are some very, very simple truths that should guide every engagement to the extent that we do need to engage. That being said, Yehudit, I tend to follow some great wisdom of my rabbi, which is never get into an argument with an Amaretz, with an ignoramus, because then they will drag you down and to their level and then beat you on experience.
We see that happening a lot these days. So it's good to have that reminder. And on that note, would you encourage young, from people to go into public service?
I There's a place for everybody. There's a place for everybody with every single type of skill. And my answer to that is a resounding yes, at the appropriate time. Some folks go in, right out of school, and there are places for long-term civil servants. Others go in with a certain level of expertise that's needed at a specific time at senior levels, and it's important, and I would say it's an obligation.
Nice. And as we wrap up, now we're at the height of the Jewish holidays. Yom Kippur is coming this week. And I'm curious, what's one thing that you've learned from this past year that you would like to incorporate into the coming year?
Well, my challenge, always, Yehudit, is one of time. We've got a limited amount of time. It's defined by, months, weeks, days, and hours. I do my best to be as ruthless as possible in my time management. But at the end of it, what we've got to rely on is ourselves, our bodies and our minds, and our families. And so I'm constantly doing a little bit of a cheshbon about how I can be doing better in taking care of and looking after my family and looking after myself. And I think that's certainly at the top of the list for me, and should be the top of the list for most others, not for me to speak to others. The one thing that keeps me going on this particular topic is a saying that the rabbi, who's a great friend of mine, who ran the Chabad operations in Hong Kong and still does for a number of decades, Rabbi Mordechai Upton, he used to talk about his mother and tell a particular story. I think that they had 13 or 15 kids, and she ran a bunch of communal organizations and had a job as a cook in the day school. People used to always ask her, Mrs. Opson, how do you do it all? How do you manage the family, community, school? And she was a good Russian lady, and she would respond very simply in her very well-known Russian accent. She would say, well, in Russia, they didn't teach us division, only multiplication.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up, please tell us where our listeners can get your book, how they can order it.
It's easy. It's an easy one click on Amazon. Be very happy for folks to purchase it and leave a review once they've gotten it, if they like it, or even if they don't like it. But Amazon is the place.
Okay. All right. Well, Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us here on the Book Shook. We wish you lots of success, Hatzlacha Rabbah, for the coming year, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. And thanks for having me, Yehudit.